All right, tonight we continue our study in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. We're going to be talking about more of these people that is considered to be in the Hall of Fame of the faithful. And as we start out, I want to do this again, and that is to show that God speaks, man hears, and faith is really composed of two parts. It's accepting what God says. Faith cometh by hearing, hearing to the Word of God, and it is putting your trust in what God says. Now, how do you know, how does God know whether you trust Him or not? Now, I'm sure God can read our minds. I mean, I know that. But I also know that there are places in the Bible that talks about, we'll be looking perhaps at one of them tonight, about the way that God knows. That God says, now I know. So how does God know whether you trust Him or not?
By the things you do.
By what you do. By whether you obey what He tells you to do. Whether you put your trust in Him or not. Now, can trust be of different degrees? Where you trust somebody a little, but you don't trust them a lot. And this is where Jesus is talking about so great faith or little faith there. So God can put us to the test, and He can see just exactly how much faith we have. It's a very, very simple thing, and we're going to see some of these things here happen tonight. That He'll tell men what to do, and then we will see what happens to them and what He has to say about it. All right, now the first man that we're going to be studying tonight now is going to be Enoch. And now then we're down in chapter 5. Down in verse 5. It says, by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death. Now there are two people that were translated that had never seen death, have not. Who were they? Enoch and who? And Elijah. Those two men never saw death. Now I might say something else, and that is that there's going to be a lot of us who never see death. What do I mean by that? Okay, at the last coming, it says that He'll come with that trumpet, and what's going to happen, that the dead in Christ shall rise first, then what's going to happen to those of us who are left and remain? Are we going to die? No, we're going to be changed in a moment, just like that. Going to be caught up with God in there. But here are two men that's already done that, and the only two men in history that we find anything about. So now, Enoch was translated, and he was translated by faith. So the idea is that Enoch was a man who lived by faith. He heard what God said. He put his trust in what God said. He did what God said. And as a result, he was such a good man that God just translated him and didn't allow him to see death. So it said, he was translated that he should not see death, and he was not found. Now, I think that's just kind of an interesting statement that puts some humanity in the situation. A lot of times we read over the scriptures and we don't stop and think about, this really happened. These things really happen, and you don't just read over it, and he was not found, and you go on like that. What happens when all of a sudden there is a wife that doesn't come home, or a young person, a teenager, that doesn't come home? What happens? They just disappear. What happens?
Major search.
There's a major search, isn't there? We go out and we begin searching, and we look to see what in the world has happened to this individual. Do you suppose they did that back in those days? Now, the reason I put up here 2 Kings is because it actually says that in 2 Kings 2:17, where it's talking about Elijah. It said they went out and they searched for him for 3 days. They looked around for 3 days to try to find him. Now, when you look at the country that they're in over there, they're not in the Cascade Mountains like we are, where you can hide around every corner, but it's a great desolate land, and they didn't have automobiles where he might got on his automobile and driven away for 500 miles and so forth, like we search different states today. But all of a sudden, he's out there in the field, and all of a sudden, he's not there. He's gone. And so everybody goes out and they look for him. And they look for him. Many people, I think in Elijah's case, I think it said 50 men were out looking for 3 days to try to find Elijah. And they couldn't find him. Now, they went out and they couldn't find Enoch. Now, an interesting thing about this is, it said, because God translated him, for he had witness borne to him that before his translation he had been well-pleasing unto God. Now, this is a great thing. And I don't know how it happened. I suppose God just told him. But stop to think what it would be like if God were to tell you, that's what bear witness means, that he tell you, you are a person that's well-pleasing to me. You're well-pleasing to me. So he had that witness given to him by God that he was well-pleasing to him. Now, here's all that you find the Bible says about this. As you go back and you look at the life of Enoch, and Enoch walked with God. Now, here it is, as you look at this, up here in the Hebrew letter, why was it that Enoch was translated? He was translated by faith, wasn't it? Because of his faith. Now then down here, and Enoch walked with God. What does that terminology mean? Enoch walked with God. He lived with him. His whole life was around God, doing what God would have him to do. And he was not, for God took him. Now, just like that, just that quick, your inspired writers tell about a person that was translated. Let me ask you another question. If somebody was translated today, how many chapters, how many newspapers, how many things, if a person was going to write a book about, how much would be devoted to that individual? It'd be an awesome amount, wouldn't it? And this is one of the things that you look at, and you have to stand amazed at the brevity of the Bible. In something like this that is just absolutely so overwhelming, just one little old statement. But on the other hand, even when you come down to the virgin birth of Christ, how much is written about that? Just a short little bit is written about that. When you talk about the life of Christ, from the time that he was brought back as a little babe up to Nazareth until he was 12 years old, how much is written about that? One verse. See? Luke 2:52 tells about that one thing. Inspired writers didn't get carried away with talking about a lot of things that are very interesting to us, just as human interest stories. That's all that you find in the Bible about him. That is in the Old Testament. Now here's another thing, and it's an interesting thing of note, I think. It's just an interesting thing. That is, Enoch was prophesying about 900 years before Noah started the ark. Now, before we read any farther about what he was saying there, he was prophesying about 900 years before Noah started the ark. Why did God tell Noah to build an ark? Oh, I know the answer to that. It was because he was going to send a flood, wasn't he? Why was he going to send a flood? Because the whole world is evil. Every thought and imagination of man's heart was evil continually. So the world was evil. Now look, 900 years before God told him to build the ark, God had sent out Enoch. And Enoch was a prophet. He was a preacher. In Jude 14 it says, "And to these also Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, to convict all of the ungodly of all their ungodly works of ungodliness which they have ungodly wrought, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Now, what kind of a preacher would you say Enoch was? Was he what you'd call a real fireball, or was he a real gentle person? He's talking to them here, and Jude said, here's what he did. He convicted them all all of the ungodly, these are the kind of people, ungodly people of their works of ungodliness. This is what they did. He said, ungodly people did ungodly things, which they have ungodly wrought. In other words, ungodly people did ungodly things in ungodly ways. Boy, he just hit him. In other words, there's just nothing good about it here. And all the hard things which the ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So Enoch lived in a time when the world was full of sin. 900 years later, it was so bad that God said, I'm going to eradicate all humans off of the face of the earth. Now, that really is all that we know about Enoch. But here's the interesting thing. And that is the Hebrew writer puts this in there to teach us this. So he comes to the conclusion, and he said, and without faith, it is impossible to be well-pleasing unto him. So he uses Enoch. Enoch was a man that lived by faith. God told him, you are well-pleasing to me, because that's the kind of individual you are. So the Hebrew writer said, and without faith, it is impossible to be well-pleasing unto him. For he that cometh to God must believe two things. What now are the two things that you must believe? The first thing, you must believe that he is. What does that mean? You must believe God exists. You must believe in God. See, that's the first thing. Then he says, and that he is a rewarder of them that seek after him. So God does exist, and God does reward the people who seek after him. That really is what faith is all about. Faith is believing that God exists, believing in him, hearing him, then putting your trust in him, seeking after him. So that's the story about Enoch telling us there. Now remember, this whole chapter is filled full of people, and we'll pass on here, but each one has its own story telling us what faith really is. Now let's turn to Noah. The next one, God told Noah what to do. And the interesting thing is, Noah did it all. Now when you turn back to Genesis, the 6th chapter, there's where God told Noah to build the ark. He said, you build the ark, 120 years I'm going to destroy the world. Down in verse 22, it says, and Noah did all that God commanded. Then in chapter 7 and verse 5 it says, and Noah did all that God commanded. Now that's important for us to understand. So we'll try to put this faith and works thing together. Now Noah did everything that God told him to do. So you have this then. You have by faith Noah. Now let's see what Noah did by faith. First of all, it says, by faith Noah, being warned of God concerning things not seen as yet. So this is telling now, God spoke to Noah. He spoke to Noah and he told him things nobody had ever seen. Nobody had ever seen. By the way, has anybody ever seen it since Noah's day, of where the rains and the floods came so big that it eradicated the total population of the earth? No. It's a once in a planet existence. And so Noah had never seen anything like this. But Noah heard about it. God told him, this is what I'm going to do. And he gave him how many years to build a boat? How many years is it before I'm going to do this? 120 years. That's a long time. Could you build a boat in 120 years? That's a long time. But he says, Noah moved with godly fear. So now, what's the key in here? Did Noah hear God? Yeah. Did Noah move? Did Noah act? See? Noah acted with godly fear. He had that godly respect, and so he got busy doing what God told him to do. Well, what do you suppose he did? He was moved with godly fear. What do you suppose he did? Well, he just did what God told him to do. Did it make sense? What God told him to do, did it make sense? No, but he did what God told him to do. And so he built that great, gigantic ark. So it says, by faith, Noah prepared an ark. By faith, he prepared an ark. Let us look at this again in Bible talk. How did Noah prepare that ark? How many years did he work? 120 years. Now, I want you to stop to think what all it would take to prepare that ark. Did they have their wood mills around at that time, Weyerhaeuser and so forth, where they ordered up, or Home Depot, and said, deliver me out? No. They had to go to the woods, and they had to cut everything. They had to hew it down. They had to drag it in. They had to put it all together. They had to do all of this thing. When you get to thinking, could you do it in 120 years? Now let me ask you another question. Suppose that we picked you up and dropped you off up in the Cascade Mountains, and you can't come out. There was no modern things there. You're just up there in a great big, gigantic trees. Could you build an ark in 120 years? Where'd you get your tools? How many years would it take you to work on that? When you cut down one of those great gigantic trees, how would you go about splitting it up? And so you get to thinking about what all Noah had to do. It was a gigantic job that he had to do. So he had to work for this 120 years. But now, after he had worked for 120 years, what does the Hebrew writer say he did? How did Noah prepare the ark? By faith. God didn't say, oh, he prepared the ark by working so hard. No, he prepared the ark by faith. He did what I told him to do. Now the result of preparing this ark, it says, through which he condemned the world. You say, well, what does that mean? What happened to the rest of the world? When Noah built the ark, got in it like God told him to do, what happened to all the rest of the world? It was all destroyed. It was all condemned in there. And here now is what happened to Noah in the ark. And became heir of righteousness, which is according to faith. Now let's go back to our Romans class, and I want you to think about that. That's the book that talks about salvation or righteousness by faith. Our righteousness is by faith. God makes a man righteous by faith. Now Noah was a righteous man. Noah inherited salvation on the basis of righteousness, which is according to faith. So, was Noah saved by faith? Yeah, Noah was saved by faith. That's what the Hebrew writer is wanting us to see. By faith, Noah built that ark. And Noah, then it says, he was an heir of righteousness. What made Noah righteous, a righteous man? Because of his faith. But when you look at his faith, what does faith consist of? What does it consist of? It consists of hearing what God says and putting your trust in what God says. See, that's the whole point. That's what faith is in there. Let's look at it like this. Noah worked for 120 years preparing that ark. But he wasn't made righteous by his works. No way. Doesn't say he was made righteous by his works. How was Noah made righteous? By his faith, according to faith. So let me ask you a question. Does works make any difference? Yeah. How much difference would works make in Noah's life? If Noah had said, well, I believe that there's going to be a flood, but building an ark like that is just a pretty gigantic thing, and How would Noah have been a righteous man? See? So keep in mind, whatever God asks you to do, you do it. And after you've done everything that God told you to do, then you stand up and you say, look how wonderful I am. Is that right? No. No. The Lord gave a parable. He said there's a servant that worked for his master all day long. The master came in that evening, and the master says, prepare my supper. And so the servant prepared the supper. After he'd been working all day long, he had to prepare the supper for the master. And you kind of feel sorry for him. And the Lord said, I want you to understand this. After you have done everything that you can do, everything the master asks of you, work all day, prepare my supper. After you've done everything, what are you to tell yourself when you go to bed that night? I am an unprofitable servant. I've got more than I deserve. My master is giving me more than I deserve. And that's the way we need to look at ourselves. And if we have that attitude, that disposition, then that will ingrain within us true humility, of what true humility is. Realizing there's no way on this earth that we could give our body to be burned. We could give our wealth to the poor. We could, and you go on and on and on. But there wouldn't be enough in there to deserve eternal life that God is giving us. We'd still be unprofitable servants. Salvation is still based on grace. And God says, I'm giving it to you, not because you're such good workers, but because you are so faithful that you will do everything I tell you to do. So we don't want to ever separate those two, but we don't want to get off balance and see one without the other that is in here. There's another passage when you're talking about Noah that's an interesting passage. 1 Peter 3:21. It said, wherein 8 souls were saved through water, which is after a true likeness, even baptism doth also now save you. Now, I want to ask you here, it says Noah and 8 souls were saved through or by water. What does that mean? How could that be that's in there? That 8 souls were saved through or by water. I thought they were saved by the boat, the ark. That's right. It's the water that washed all the sin away in it. And the boat lifted them up. Could they have been saved without the boat? No, couldn't have been saved without the boat, but it's the water that washed them away. So Peter said, I want you to understand that. I want you to understand that is a figure. That's an example of how we're saved by baptism. It's our baptism. It's that act that our sins are washed away. Just like the water washed them away. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you see it in that sense there. So this stands as that example that we've got there. Now let's move on to Abraham. The next example is Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, did Abraham hear God? Faith cometh by hearing. Now, let me ask you this. Abraham obeyed and Noah obeyed. Why did one leave his family and the other build a boat? Pretty simple, isn't it? Pretty simple. They were doing what God told them to do. See? Now, he obeyed to go out into a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing whither he went. Now, I want you to take a little phrase and pack it away back there somewhere in your mind. Don't let it clog up your mind, but kind of keep it a little fresh for a little while. Now, he was to go out into a place. Where was that place, by the way? Where did God send him? See? Over to Canaan. Over there. We know today is Palestine. He was to receive for an inheritance. So he was supposed to receive Canaan for an inheritance. Just keep that plugged away up there for just a minute. Now, not knowing where he went. Well, that really is what faith is all about, isn't it? If you knew what was going to happen, isn't it a lot easier to do it than just doing it on the basis of faith? See? If you could see and you knew, but that would be knowledge. Faith is not based on knowledge. Faith is based on hearing what God says. Think what this would mean. It's so easy for you and I to talk about Abraham. What would you do if you were told by God, I want you to get up and leave your family and leave your home and take off? Where to, Lord? Into a place that I will show you. Just leave. How would you feel? Which way would you go? What would you do? He didn't tell him, I'm going to send you down to Canaan. You just leave and you go into a place that I'm going to tell you. So Abraham doesn't have the slightest idea where he's going. So he obeyed. He got up and he went. Now another thing he did, another act, by faith he became a sojourner in the land of promise. Now when he got down to Canaan, what did God tell him to do then after he got down to Canaan? Did he say, now I want you to settle down, build your house out here, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea where you'll have a nice view? No. You go over here. Move over here. Over here. Down here. Back up where you started. Now down to Egypt. Now back up. Over here. Over here. How long did God keep him moving around? 25 years. He kept him moving around before he ever gave him a son. He became a sojourner. Now people called him a Hebrew. Why did they call him a Hebrew? What does the word Hebrew mean? A sojourner, one who walks around. So that's what he was doing. He said, in the land of promise, as in a land not his own, God had promised it to him, but it wasn't his. Dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, and heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now that is an interesting statement right there. Really interesting statement for 2 or 3 reasons. And that is, Abraham was told by God something that you and I do not have any idea about. In the Old Testament you read about it, it doesn't tell us. But God told Abraham about a future life. He told Abraham about a city that's not made with hands. A city that's been made by God. And he told Abraham, you go out and you do this, and you're going to inherit that city. Those Old Testament people were given that promise of an eternal city that's out there. They could see that city by faith. And we'll see more about it. When Abraham was roaming around, going from here to here to here to here, one of the reasons he didn't get discouraged was because he knew he was serving his God, and his God had promised him, after it's all over, you're going to have a city out here that's built by God. So you say, what does the Old Testament teach about heaven? Very, very little. That's where we say, do people in the Old Testament know, about heaven and life after death? Well, here it is. They look for a city whose maker and builder is God. Another interesting statement to kind of throw along here, and it's about the only one I can think of right now. What did David say when his little baby died? And they came out and told him, they said, your baby's died. Up to this time, David was crying and praying to God. They said, your baby just died. And they thought that he had, in such grief and praying and crying so hard before it died, that when they gave him that message, he might just lose his mind. They were really concerned. But David said, okay. He got up, went in and washed, and started going about his business. And they were wondering, why did you do that? You remember what he said about that baby? Yeah, I can't bring him back to me, but I can go to him. So David understood that. All right. By faith, Abraham did that. That's a great thing that he did. God told him, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. So Abram went as Jehovah spoke unto him. Let's look at Sarah. Sarah, his wife. Now, as you look at this woman, when Sarah was 65, Abraham received the promise. Abraham was 75. Sarah was 65. When God told him, get up, leave your home, go to a land that I'm going to tell you. You just go. So Sarah got up and went with Abraham at age 65. Years later, she hadn't had a child. And Abraham starts trying to figure this out. Now I want you to note, we're talking about faith. Abraham, he comes to the conclusion that they are getting so old, they're past the age of childbearing. She's never had a child in all of her life. And now then she's up somewhere in her probably 80s somewhere. It's obvious they can't have a child. Abraham's trying to figure out what God meant. And Abraham then figures out, hey, I got a little nephew. I don't have any offspring, any children. And Eliezer, he's going to inherit everything I've got. So that would be what God meant. So Abraham told God, he said, take Eliezer, and use him for my seed. And God said, no, Abraham, I'm not talking about your nephew. I'm talking about you. You are going to have a son. Now, think about that when they went home to the tent that night. Just stop to think. Sarah wasn't there. I'm sure Abraham and Sarah had talked about, must be the nephew. Abraham goes home and he said, Sarah, God told me today that I was going to have a son. It would be a boy that came out of my bowels. Probably in his 90s. What kind of talk do you suppose they had in that Bedouin tent that night? Well, next thing might help us a little bit as we're looking at this here. He said it's going to come out of your own bowels. You'll be an heir. At age 77, Sarah made a very generous offer by giving Hagar. I can just see this. The gears are clicking. You're going to have a son. And he's going to be a son that comes out of your bowels. But what's God said about Sarah so far? Nothing. What had Abraham determined before that God probably meant? Probably meant through the nephew. Sarah gets to thinking. And she said, Abraham, why don't you go in to my slave and have a baby by her. I'll take that baby when it's born and put it on my knee, which is what they did to adopt the baby. That baby will be our baby. So that must be what God wants done. You suppose they talked about it? Yeah, they talked about it. I don't know how long they talked about it. But put yourself back there. They talked about it. Finally, Abraham says that's probably the right thing. So he went in, had a baby. Ishmael was born, and trouble started, didn't it? See? Trouble started in there. Now at about age 100, Abraham learned that Sarah was to give birth to the seed that would bless the world. Finally, God told Abraham, not through Ishmael, I'm talking about you're going to have a baby through Sarah. So now God has spoken through Sarah. Now what will faith demand? Now faith will demand that they believe Abraham will be the dad and Sarah will be the mom. See? That's what it takes for faith now. Well, a little bit later on, God comes back and finally Sarah hears the story herself. She hears the story. She was in a tent. The angel came back and told him, he said, next year when I come around, Sarah, your wife, is going to have a baby. Now, Sarah was in the tent, and you remember what she did when she heard that? She laughed. She laughed. She couldn't believe such a thing as that would happen. Now, when she laughed, the angel went over and he asked her, he said, why did you laugh? You remember what she said? Oh, what's that? Yeah, I didn't laugh. Yes, you did laugh. Yes, you did. And then he said, this is what is going to happen. Let's put that in proper perspective. Because a lot of times I think we blow that out. Blow it out of perspective all the time. If God were to speak to you tonight as you're driving home, what would you do? Are you the kind of person that would just say, oh, excuse me, Lord, I need to make a right-hand turn up here. And he said, I want you to, and tells you some great thing, like you're going to have a baby, regardless of your age. Oh, okay, Lord. And you just go on home and fix dinner, wouldn't you? Wouldn't bother you at all, would it? See? No. No. When God talked to these people, they had the same kind of feelings that we have. And what are your reactions when you get good news so good it can't be true? It's totally impossible. You know it's totally impossible. It can't be true. What's your reaction? You just shake your head and say, well, okay, is that what you do? Or do you go, oh, sure, yeah, uh-huh. Yeah, I'm sure, you know, that's going to happen. That's in there. This is a pretty normal reaction for Sarah. Now, interesting point that I want you to make is this, that we talk about Sarah a lot, Sarah in there laughing. But back in chapter 17 of the book of Genesis, when God talked to Abraham and told him Sarah was going to have a baby, do you know what Abraham did? He laughed. He laughed. How does that put Sarah in perspective? When Abraham heard the news, he laughed. Now, I'm sure when it's talking about laughed, it didn't mean he just broke up like you'd heard a joke and fell on the ground laughing and hysterical. But he laughed. It just, it's kind of like that it can't be true situation. Abraham laughed. We don't talk too much about him laughing, but we do a lot of talking about Sarah laughing, don't we? And that's the only reason I was bringing it out. Now then, we have here the story about Sarah. That Sarah, now, she heard this, and now she's accepting the fact that she's going to have a baby. Did she have a baby? Yep, she had a baby. Under all these conditions, she had a baby at that old age. It's in there. Now, we come back, and we take that baby that she had, Isaac, and Abraham now is going to take him up and going to offer him. But before that, let's go back, and I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to verse 13, because Abraham's going to offer him in verse 17. In verse 13, all these died in faith. That is, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob. They all died in faith, not having received the promises. Now, the promises that God had given to them was that you're going to have the land of Canaan, you're going to have a great nation, you're going to have so many people that it's like the stars of heaven that you can't even count them. How many people would have been in Abraham's family at that time, even when Abraham died? You know how many was in his family when they went down into Egypt? 70. See? Only just a few. They'd not received these promises. Had they received the promises of, through thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed? No, they hadn't received that. Christ hadn't been born. But now, they died in faith, not having received the promises, but they believed they were coming, but having seen them and greeted them from afar. That's important. I hope all of us can do that. I hope we can look ahead, look into the future, and think about the promises that God has given us. All the great things that's going to happen. The day you die, being escorted by angels, going into the paradise world, seeing Abraham, being up there in a place that Paul says is very far better. Being able to go to a place where you'll never lay down and take another nap. There'll never be another night. There'll never be another day that's too hot or another day that's too cold. All these blessings are out there. That's what it's waiting for us. Can you see them from afar? Can you see them actually that's there? That is what is going to take place. He said they did. They greeted him from afar, and having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's the reason they could be happy and sojourn around and never have a place to put their foot. But they confessed, we're just pilgrims here on this earth. This is not our permanent home. Let's don't ever get so attached to anything that we said, here I am, and I'll never, ever, ever be moved again. I'm going to stay right here. I have the perfect place, and I'll make it more perfect all the time. I'll have all of the luxuries that are round about me. That's not what being a pilgrim is all about. If you happen to live in a place like that, fine. But understand, it belonged to somebody else yesterday, and it'll belong to somebody else tomorrow, and you'll be gone. You're just here. And the fact that you have a piece of paper written out by somebody that said, that's your land, means nothing at all. Somebody else will have a piece of paper. We're just pilgrims here upon this earth. So that's what kept them faithful. Understanding, that's what they were out there. 14. For they that say such thing make it manifest or known that they are seeking after a country of their own. When people live in this world and understand this world is not our home, they make it clear we're seeking for another country. And if indeed they had been mindful of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. Now, what country did Abraham go out of? Ur of the Chaldees. Could he have gone back to Ur? Yeah, anytime he wanted to. He could have turned around and gone back. God didn't force him. But the fact he never went back. He would have had a good life back there. He'd had family. But nope, he didn't go back there. They had the opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country. That is a heavenly. Abraham was looking for a better country, a heavenly country, that spiritual country. Wherefore God is not ashamed of them to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. So, because they had this faith, God was not ashamed to be called their God. How many times did God introduce himself as I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He wasn't ashamed of them. Why wasn't he ashamed of them? Because they were living by faith. They were living by faith, and they were looking for that country, a different country, a spiritual country, and a city that was prepared by God. And so he said, that's what faith is all about. And that's why we should have that same kind of faith. Okay, now then, look here in verse 17. As we go here, by faith Abraham, being tried, offered up Isaac. Yea, he that had gladly received the promises was offering up his only begotten son, even he to whom it was said, In Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God is able to raise up even from the dead, from whence he did also, in a figure, receive him back. So now the Hebrew writer just takes that long story in the book of Genesis and encompasses it down. God had told Abraham, it's in Isaac that your seed's going to come, not in anybody else. Let's look at Abraham's life. God had called Abraham to leave his family and his homeland. He did. God had asked Abraham to sojourn in a strange land when in fact he lived there for about 100 years. He lived there 25 before he ever had any children. Then God promised to give him a son, and then he withheld the son for another 25 years. Does that take faith to just continue on believing that the son will be born? You see? And then God finally told him he wouldn't inherit any land in Palestine, and his family would go into a captivity into another country. Now remember what I told you to hold in the back of your mind a little while ago? What did God tell him? I'm going to take you into a land that I'll give to you for an inheritance. And God said, no, I'm not going to give you any, Abraham. Not anything. Luke, in the book of Acts, 7th chapter of the book of Acts, said God didn't even give Abraham enough land to put his foot on. He didn't have title to that much land. God said, Abraham, I'm not going to give you any. In fact, I'm going to take all your kids and I'm going to send them into a far country as slaves, and they'll be there for 400 years. Then I'll bring them back and they'll inherit the land. How would you like to have that promise? Would it take any faith to believe in that? That you're going to be taken off into captivity for 400 years? Then you'll come back and you'll have all this? Then after all of this, God asked him to send one son away. Abraham loved Ishmael. Sarah didn't. But Abraham loved him. God said, now take him out, him and his mom, in the desert and turn him loose. And Abraham did it. Broke his heart. God finally asked him to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Doing this would void everything Abraham had lived for. When Abraham goes up and does this, it's all over. Now you read about this in the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis. Our time is almost up, so let's go through it rapidly. Here it is in this particular chapter that God finally comes to Abraham and he said, Abraham, now I want you to take Isaac, your only son, and take him up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. Well, Abraham didn't even think about it twice. He got up the next morning, got his slaves together, got the wood together, because there's not a lot of wood there, and they took off. They walked for 42 miles, a 3-day journey. What do you suppose was in Abraham's heart as he's walking with his boy for 3 days, knowing he's taking him down and killing him? Never faltered. Went down there, got down to the base of Mount Moriah, and he told his slaves, he said, you men stay here. The lad and I will go up on the mountain and offer a sacrifice, and then we'll come back. He used the plural. We'll come back. So he took the men there. He took the wood, and as they're going up, Isaac looked at him and said, Father, we have the wood. Where's the lamb for the sacrifice? And Abraham said, God will provide the lamb. And Abraham knew what the lamb was going to be. When they got up there, he laid all the wood out, got it all ready, so he could kill his son on the altar, then burn his body. And he took his son, he tied him up, very methodical. He took it, and then he took that knife and started to cut his throat. He started to cut his throat, and it was at that time, it says, Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son. An angel of Jehovah called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, Here am I. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know. Now I know. This is the testing period. This is when God tests you and knows the faith you have. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham then untied his boy. God provided a goat that was out there in the thicket that was caught. He brought him in, he sacrificed him, and he and Isaac went home. So Abraham was called upon to do the greatest things that faith could possibly be asked for. All of his life, he had to operate on the basis of faith. And down at the end, he was called to do the most horrendous thing that man has ever been called upon to do. But by faith, a man is saved. And he's trying to show us this is what it means to live by faith. Okay, that's where we close.